The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of City Hall as Carmen Rodriguez straightened her navy blue blazer. At 45 years old, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had worked her way up from walking a beat to becoming one of the most respected officers in the Metropolitan Police Department. Today was different from all other days in her 20-year career. Today, she would make history. The large wooden doors of the conference room opened, and Mayor Thompson stepped out with a broad smile. "Captain Rodriguez, please come in," he said, gesturing toward the room filled with city officials and press members. Carmen took a deep breath and walked in, her black heels clicking against the polished floor. She saw her teenage daughter Maria and her husband Robert sitting in the front row, both beaming with pride. Maria gave her a small thumbs up, just like she used to do when Carmen would drop her off at school. The ceremony began with Mayor Thompson addressing the crowd. "Today marks a significant milestone for our city," he announced, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "After an extensive search and careful consideration, we are appointing not only the most qualified candidate, but also the first black female chief of police in our city's history." Carmen stood tall as the mayor continued to list her achievements. Top of her class at the police academy, 15 years of community outreach experience, a master's degree in criminal justice, and a record of reducing crime rates in every district she's supervised. But what made her most proud was the letter from Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly resident from her old beat, who wrote about how Carmen had helped her grandson stay away from gangs and get into college. After taking the oath, Carmen stepped up to the podium. She looked at the crowd, seeing both familiar and new faces. Some officers from Precinct 23, her new command, sat in the back rows. She noticed their uncertain expressions. They hadn't expected someone like her to be their new chief. "I stand here today not just as your new chief of police," Carmen began, speaking clearly and confidently, "but as someone who grew up in the same streets we patrol. I know what it's like to feel afraid when you see a police car in your rearview mirror, even when you've done nothing wrong. I also know what it's like to wear this badge and face danger to protect our community." She paused, making eye contact with different people in the room. "Precinct 23 faces many challenges. We have work to do in building trust between our officers and the community. Change won't happen overnight, but it will happen." After the ceremony, Carmen sat alone in her new office, looking at the nameplate on her desk that read Chief Carmen Rodriguez. She picked up a framed photo of her first day as a rookie officer, remembering how scared and determined she had been. Now, 20 years later, that same determination filled her heart, but for a different reason. She opened her laptop and began reviewing the files of Precinct 23. The statistics troubled her. Higher rates of traffic stops involving minorities, multiple complaints about officer conduct, and declining community trust scores. She knew that announcing changes from above wouldn't work. She needed to understand the real situation on the ground. Taking out her personal phone, Carmen called her husband. "Robert, I'm going to be home late next week," she said, already forming a plan. "I need to see how things really work in my precinct before I start making changes." "You're going undercover in your own precinct?" Robert asked, knowing his wife's thinking process after 23 years of marriage. "Not exactly undercover," Carmen replied, smiling. "Just observing. In my regular clothes, driving my own car, I need to see how our officers interact with people when they don't know the chief is watching." As the sun set over the city, Carmen gathered her things to head home. Tomorrow would be her official first day, but next week she would begin her real work. She looked out the window at the streets of Precinct 23, her mind already thinking about the changes she hoped to make. Before leaving, she placed her mother's old Bible on her desk, the same one she had kept with her through every promotion. Inside was a worn photo of her mother in her nurse's uniform, another woman who had broken barriers in her time. "We're going to make a difference here, Mama," Carmen whispered, touching the photo gently. "Real change, one step at a time." A week had passed since Carmen Rodriguez's appointment as chief of police. The evening air was cool as she drove her black BMW through the streets of Precinct 23. She had chosen to wear casual clothes, a simple blue sweater and black pants. Her police badge and ID stayed hidden in her purse, exactly where she wanted them. The clock on her dashboard showed 9:45 p.m. Carmen had spent the past 3 hours driving through different neighborhoods, watching her officers work from a distance. She noticed how some areas had more patrol cars than others, and how officers interacted differently with people depending on which street they were on. As she turned onto Maple Street, blue and red lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Carmen checked her speedometer. She was going exactly the speed limit. Her turn signals were working, and her registration was up to date. A small smile crossed her face as she pulled over, knowing this might be the insight she needed into her department's practices. Officer Mike Thompson and Officer Steve Chen approached her car, one on each side. Their flashlights beamed through her windows, much brighter than necessary for a well-lit street. Carmen noticed how Officer Thompson's hand rested near his weapon, a standard practice, but his posture seemed more tense than the situation required. "License and registration," Officer Thompson said sharply, not bothering with the usual good evening. Carmen noticed he hadn't mentioned why he pulled her over. "Good evening, officer," Carmen replied calmly, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" Officer Chen spoke from the passenger side, his flashlight still pointed at her face. "Your right taillight looks dim. We need to see your license and registration. Is this your car, ma'am?" Carmen knew her taillights were perfect. She'd checked all her car's lights just yesterday. She also noticed how quickly they'd asked if the car was hers. She reached slowly for her glove compartment, aware of how both officers tensed at her movement. "Moving to get my registration," she said clearly, remembering how she trained officers to appreciate when drivers narrated their actions. She pulled out the papers and her license, handing them to Officer Thompson. The officers stepped back to their patrol car. Through her mirrors, Carmen watched them talking and looking at their computer. She pulled out her phone and quietly made notes about their badge numbers and the patrol car number. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Carmen knew a simple taillight check shouldn't take this long. She could hear them running an extensive background check, something that wasn't standard procedure for a minor traffic violation. When they returned, Officer Thompson's tone had changed. The background check had probably shown she lived in an expensive neighborhood. "Mrs. Rodriguez, can you step out of the vehicle?" "Is there a problem, officer?" Carmen asked, knowing there wasn't. "Just step out of the car, please. We need to verify some information." Officer Chen's flashlight was still trained on her, even though the street lights made it unnecessary. Carmen unbuckled her seatbelt slowly. "I'm going to get out now," she said, narrating her actions again. As she stepped out, she noticed how both officers subtly moved their hands closer to their weapons. "Can you explain how you can afford this vehicle?" Officer Thompson asked, his tone suggesting he'd already made assumptions about her. "We've had some reports of stolen luxury cars in the area." That was a lie, and Carmen knew it. There hadn't been any such reports filed in the past month. She stood calmly, studying both officers' faces. Officer Chen at least had the decency to look somewhat uncomfortable with his partner's questioning. "I can explain everything," Carmen said, reaching for her purse. Both officers immediately took defensive stances. "Keep your hands where we can see them," Officer Thompson commanded. Carmen smiled slightly, keeping her movements deliberate and slow. "Officers, I'm reaching for my credentials. I think you'll find them very interesting." She'd seen enough. This stop had confirmed everything she needed to know about the problems in her precinct. As she reached for her badge, she thought about how this moment would change not just these officers' night, but the entire department's future. The stage was set for a lesson these officers would never forget, but more importantly, for the kind of change her precinct desperately needed. Time seemed to slow down on that street corner as Carmen stood between Officers Thompson and Chen. The patrol car's lights still flashed silently against the surrounding buildings, creating alternating patterns of red and blue on everyone's faces. "Ma'am, I'll ask you one more time," Officer Thompson said, his voice carrying an edge of authority that Carmen recognized all too well. "What's in your purse?" "Officer Thompson," Carmen replied calmly, noting how he hadn't worn his nameplate but she'd memorized it from his earlier badge number. "I have my police credentials in my purse. Would you like me to show them to you?" Both officers exchanged quick glances, confusion crossing their faces. Officer Chen's flashlight beam wavered slightly. "You're saying you're a police officer?" Thompson asked, skepticism clear in his voice. "Which precinct?" Carmen noticed how neither officer had lowered their guard. If anything, they seemed more suspicious now. She watched as Officer Thompson reached for his radio, probably to call in and verify her claim. "Before you make that call," Carmen said, keeping her voice steady, "let's review what's happened here. You pulled me over, claiming my taillight was dim, which it isn't. You ran an extensive background check for a simple traffic stop. You asked me to step out of my vehicle without probable cause, and then questioned how I could afford my car." Officer Chen shifted uncomfortably, his younger face showing the first signs of worry. Thompson, however, maintained his stern expression. "Ma'am, we're just following standard procedure," Thompson defended, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. "Standard procedure?" Carmen raised an eyebrow. "I've been on the force for 20 years, Officer Thompson. Would you like me to recite the actual standard procedures for a routine traffic stop?" Now uncertainty crept into Thompson's expression. 20 years was a long time, longer than his own service record. Carmen could see him trying to place her face, wondering if he'd seen her at headquarters or in training sessions. "Which division did you say you were from?" Chen asked, his flashlight finally lowering. Carmen smiled slightly. "I didn't say, but since you asked." She reached slowly for her purse, making sure both officers could see her movements clearly. "I'm actually quite new to this precinct. Started just last week." As she opened her purse, Officer Thompson's radio crackled. "Unit 247, status update on your traffic stop." "Unit 247, stand by," Thompson responded, his eyes fixed on Carmen's hands as she reached into her purse. The street was quiet except for the soft hum of the patrol car's engine. A few curious neighbors had come to their windows, watching the scene unfold. Carmen could feel the tension building as she pulled out her credentials. "Here you go, officers," she said, handing her ID to Thompson. "I think this will explain everything." Officer Thompson's face went through a remarkable series of expressions as he read the ID card. His eyes widened, his jaw dropped slightly, and all the color drained from his face. Without a word, he handed the ID to Officer Chen, whose reaction was equally dramatic. "Chief Rodriguez?" Chen stammered, looking between the ID and Carmen's face repeatedly. "That's correct, Officer Chen," Carmen replied, standing a bit straighter. "And while this isn't exactly how I plan to meet my officers, it's certainly been educational." Thompson's earlier confidence had completely evaporated. "Chief, we didn't. We were just—" Carmen held up her hand, stopping his stuttered explanation. "What you were just doing is exactly what we need to talk about, but not here, not now." She looked at both officers carefully. "Tomorrow morning, my office, 9 a.m. sharp. We're going to have a long discussion about what standard procedures actually look like in this precinct." Both officers stood frozen, still processing what had just happened. Carmen took her ID back and turned to return to her car, then paused. "Oh, and officers?" she said, looking back at them. "Check my taillight now. I want you both to see that it's working perfectly fine." As she got back into her BMW, Carmen watched in her rearview mirror as both officers walked to the back of her car, their flashlights confirming what she already knew. Her taillight was working perfectly. She started her engine, knowing that tomorrow would be the beginning of some very necessary changes in Precinct 23. The rest of Officers Thompson and Chen's night shift felt like the longest hours of their careers. After Chief Rodriguez drove away, they sat in their patrol car for several minutes, neither one speaking. The weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on both their shoulders. "She planned this," Thompson finally said, staring at the steering wheel. His usual confidence had disappeared completely. "The new chief went undercover in her own precinct, and we just gave her every reason to fire us both." Chen rubbed his face with his hands. "Did you see how calm she was? The whole time, she was just watching us, taking mental notes. Man, we really messed up." Their patrol car radio crackled with routine calls, but neither officer moved to respond. Another unit would have to handle things for a few minutes while they collected themselves. Meanwhile, Carmen had parked her BMW in front of the precinct building. She sat in her car, carefully writing down every detail of the interaction while it was still fresh in her mind. Her phone buzzed, a text from her husband, Robert. "How did the observation go tonight?" Carmen typed back, "Better than expected. Or worse, depending on how you look at it." Got pulled over by my own officers. Robert's response came quickly. Are you okay? What happened? I'm fine, she replied, but tomorrow's going to be a very interesting day at the office. Inside her office, Carmen spent the next 2 hours reviewing footage from Thompson and Chen's body cameras, which she had remotely accessed. She watched the entire stop from their perspective, making detailed notes about every procedural violation, every questionable comment, and every subtle sign of bias. But something else caught her attention too. Officer Chen's hesitation at certain points, his uncomfortable glances when Thompson made inappropriate comments, these showed potential for change. Thompson's actions were more concerning, but his record showed he was actually a good officer in many ways. He had several commendations for bravery and community service. This made Carmen think carefully about how to handle tomorrow's meeting. Around midnight, Carmen's office phone rang. It was Sergeant Martinez, the night shift supervisor. Chief, Martinez said, his voice careful, I heard about what happened with Thompson and Chen. They just told me. Should I put them on administrative leave? Carmen leaned back in her chair. No, Sergeant. I want them on their regular shift tonight. But I need you to do something for me. Watch them closely. Not to catch them doing something wrong, but to see how this experience affects them right now. How are they handling it? Well, Martinez paused. They're shaken up. I've never seen Thompson so quiet. Chen keeps checking the patrol manual between calls. Good, Carmen said. That means they're thinking. That's exactly what I want. After hanging up, Carmen opened her laptop and began drafting a new training program. What happened tonight wasn't just about 2 officers. It was about systemic problems that needed systematic solutions. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her daughter Maria. Mom, is it true? Jackie's dad is a dispatcher, and he just told her you got pulled over by your own officers. Carmen smiled. News traveled fast in the police community. Yes, honey, it's true. Did you arrest them? Fire them? Make them walk the streets directing traffic? No, Carmen replied. Sometimes the best way to create change isn't through punishment, it's through education and understanding. As midnight turned to early morning, Carmen finally gathered her things to head home. Walking through the quiet precinct, she passed the desk where Thompson and Chen would check in tomorrow morning. She placed 2 folders there, their complete service records. Inside each, she had placed a single sticky note that read, Everyone has room to grow. See you at 9 a.m. Outside, the night sky was clear and starred. Carmen looked up at the precinct building, its brick facade lit by security lights. Tomorrow would be challenging for everyone involved, but necessary. Real change often started with uncomfortable moments like these. As she drove home, Carmen thought about her mother's favorite saying, sometimes the best teachers are the mistakes we catch ourselves making. Tomorrow, she would help 2 officers learn from their mistakes, not to shame them, but to make them better officers and better people. At 8:15 a.m., Carmen arrived at the precinct earlier than usual. She carried 2 cups of coffee from Maria's Cafe, the small shop where many officers got their morning coffee. As she walked through the building, other officers quickly stepped aside, whispering among themselves. The story of last night's traffic stop had spread like wildfire. In her office, Carmen arranged 3 chairs in a semicircle instead of keeping her usual setup with the desk between her and visitors. She wanted this conversation to be different. Not a boss scolding employees, but people having an honest discussion about real issues. She opened her laptop and pulled up 3 videos, the body camera footage from both officers and a collection of their previous traffic stops from the past month. The pattern was clear. Minority drivers were being stopped 3 times more often than white drivers, and their stops lasted twice as long on average. At 8:45, someone knocked on her door. It was Sergeant Martinez. Chief, he said, looking concerned, Thompson and Chen are already here. They've been sitting in the break room since 8 a.m. Thompson hasn't touched his coffee, and Chen's on his 3rd cup. Carmen nodded. How was the rest of their shift last night? Different, Martinez replied. They handled 4 more traffic stops. By the book, every single one. They even apologized to a teenager for making him wait while they ran his license. Carmen smiled slightly. Sometimes a wake-up call is all people need. Send them in at 9 sharp. While waiting, Carmen looked at the photos on her wall. her graduation from the police academy, her first day as a patrol officer, the community award she received for starting a youth program. Each image reminded her of lessons she'd learned, mistakes she'd made, and people who had given her chances to improve. At exactly 9 a.m., another knock came at her door. "Come in," Carmen called out. Officers Thompson and Chen entered, both looking like they hadn't slept much. They wore their full uniforms, perfectly pressed, badges gleaming. Thompson had even gotten a fresh haircut. "Good morning, officers," Carmen said, gesturing to the chairs. "Please have a seat. There's fresh coffee here if you'd like some." Both men sat stiffly, looking surprised at the casual arrangement of the chairs. They'd clearly expected to stand at attention while being reprimanded. "First," Carmen began, "I want to thank you both for being prompt. And Officer Chen, I hear you've been reviewing the patrol manual. That shows initiative." Chen's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected her to know that. "Chief," Thompson spoke up, his voice tight with tension, "before we begin, I want to submit this." He held out an envelope. Carmen took it but didn't open it. "Is this your resignation, Officer Thompson?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, looking straight ahead. Carmen placed the envelope on her desk, unopened. "Well, I'm not accepting it. At least not today. You know why?" Both officers looked at her, confused. "Because running away from our mistakes doesn't fix them," she said, pulling up the traffic stop videos on her laptop. "What I saw last night wasn't just about you two. It's about patterns and practices that have become normal in this precinct. Patterns were going to change." She turned the laptop so they could see their own body camera footage. "We're going to watch this together. All of it. And then we're going to have an honest conversation about what we see. No defending, no excuses, just honest observation and discussion." Thompson's shoulders relaxed slightly, while Chen let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since entering the room. "Chief," Chen ventured, Are we still employed?" Carmen picked up Thompson's resignation letter and handed it back to him. "That depends on what happens in this room today. I don't want to lose two officers with good service records. What I want is for you to understand why last night happened the way it did, and how we can make sure it never happens again." She pressed play on the video, and the events of last night began to unfold on screen. "Now, let's watch this together, and I want you to tell me what you see. Not what you think I want to hear, but what you actually see." The morning sun streamed through the office windows as three people sat together, watching a traffic stop that would change not just their lives, but potentially the entire precinct's future. The body camera footage played on Carmen's laptop, filling her office with the sounds of last night's traffic stop. She watched both officers' faces as they saw themselves through an outsider's eyes for the first time. "Stop the video there," Carmen said, posing at the moment when Thompson first approached her car. "Officer Thompson, what do you notice about your body language?" Thompson shifted in his chair, studying the frozen image. I look aggressive, Chief. My hand is already on my weapon, but there was no threat indication." "And Officer Chen," Carmen turned to the younger officer, "what about the flashlight beam? Was that positioning necessary in a well-lit street?" Chen shook his head. "No, Chief. I was shining it directly in your face. That's intimidation tactics. We're trained to use the light for safety, not to make people uncomfortable." Carmen nodded and played the video again. When they reached the part about questioning the car's ownership, she paused it again. "Would either of you like to explain why you asked if I could afford this vehicle?" Her voice remained calm, but both officers looked down at their hands. "It's what we usually do in that neighborhood when—" Thompson started, then stopped himself. The realization hit him hard. "When we see a person of color in an expensive car." The room fell silent for a moment. Chen looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. "Let me tell you a story," Carmen said, standing up and walking to her window. 10 years ago, I was driving my daughter to her piano recital. We were in our best clothes, driving through an upscale neighborhood. We got pulled over. The officer made us sit there for 45 minutes while he ran every possible check on my car. My daughter missed her recital, but more importantly, she learned that day that some people would always see her differently because of her skin color. She turned back to face them. Do you know what my daughter asked me that day? She said, "Mom, if they treat you like this even though you're a police officer, how do they treat everyone else?" Thompson's face had grown pale. Chief, we never meant. I know you didn't. Carmen interrupted gently. That's exactly the problem. These behaviors become so normal that we stop questioning them, but today, we're questioning everything. She pulled up another set of statistics on her laptop. Here are your traffic stop numbers from the past 6 months. Notice anything? Both officers leaned forward, studying the data. Chen spoke first, his voice quiet. We stop minority drivers 3 times more often than white drivers. And look at the duration of these stops, Carmen added. Average stop time for white drivers, 8 minutes. For minority drivers, 23 minutes. Why? Because we run more checks, Thompson admitted. We look harder for violations. We assume there must be something wrong? Carmen finished his sentence. Because that's what we've been trained to expect. Both officers nodded slowly, the reality of their actions sinking in. Carmen sat back down, leaning forward in her chair. Here's what's going to happen. Starting next week, you're both going to help me design new training protocols for the entire precinct. We're going to use your body camera footage, with your permission, as a teaching tool. Not to shame you, but to show others how easily bias can creep into our daily work. You're not firing us? Chen asked, still looking uncertain. Carmen shook her head. No, because officers who recognize their mistakes and want to do better are exactly the kind of officers we need. But there will be changes. She handed them each a folder. These are your new assignments. For the next month, you'll be working with community leaders in the neighborhoods you patrol. You'll attend community meetings, not in uniform, just listening. You'll hear their stories, their fears, their experiences with law enforcement. Thompson opened his folder, then looked up at Carmen. Chief, why are you giving us this chance? Carmen smiled slightly. Because 20 years ago, someone gave me a chance to learn from my mistakes. And because change doesn't happen by removing people who need to learn. It happens by helping them grow. She stood up, signaling the meeting was ending. We have a lot of work to do, officers. Are you ready to be part of that change? Both men stood, standing straighter than when they'd entered. Yes, Chief, they said in unison. As they turned to leave, Carmen called out, Oh, and Officer Thompson, keep your resignation letter. Consider it a reminder of the officer you don't want to be anymore. 2 weeks after the traffic stop incident, Precinct 23 looked very different. Carmen had turned one of the large briefing rooms into what she called the Community Connection Center. The walls, once bare except for department notices, now displayed photos and stories from the neighborhood, alongside statistics about police interactions with different communities. Officer Thompson stood at the front of this room, facing 20 of his fellow officers. His hands were slightly shaky as he held the remote control for the projector. What you're about to see, he began, his voice more humble than anyone had ever heard it, is my biggest mistake, and my greatest learning opportunity. He pressed play, and the now familiar body camera footage of the traffic stop began. In the back of the room, Carmen watched quietly. She noticed how the other officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, probably seeing their own behaviors reflected in Thompson's actions. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Chen sat in the community center wearing civilian clothes. He was attending his 3rd community meeting, just listening as local residents shared their experiences with police. An elderly black woman was speaking, her voice trembling with emotion. Every time my grandson drives to work, I pray, she said. Not just for his safety from crime, but for his safety during police stops. Do you know what that feels like? Chen wrote in his notebook, his hand gripping his pen tightly. 2 weeks ago, he might have defended police actions. Today, he just listened and learned. Back at the precinct, Carmen had introduced new procedures. Every officer's traffic stop data was now publicly displayed on a board in the roll call room. Not to shame anyone, but to make patterns visible. Green dots showed stops with clear violations, yellow dots for warnings, and red dots for stops that resulted in no citations. The dots were also coded by race and gender of the drivers. Look at your dots, Carmen told her officers during morning briefing. If your board shows a pattern, ask yourself why. We're not here to judge, we're here to improve. The changes weren't always easy. Some officers resisted, claiming it would make their jobs harder. Carmen had expected this. What makes our job harder? She announced during a staff meeting. is losing the community's trust. Every unfair stop, every biased interaction, they're like withdrawals from a bank of trust that takes years to build. She implemented new training programs. Instead of just teaching tactical procedures, officers now spend time learning about cultural sensitivity and the history of police relations with minority communities. But Carmen made sure it wasn't just classroom learning. Every officer was required to spend one day each month in plain clothes, experiencing the community from a different perspective. They rode public buses, walked through neighborhoods, and sat in local restaurants, not to police, but to understand. Thompson and Chen have become unexpected leaders in this change. Their honesty about their experience with the chief had earned them respect. Officers began coming to them for advice about difficult situations. "I pulled someone over yesterday," a rookie officer told Chen during lunch break. "But then I remembered your story and asked myself, would I have made this stop if the driver was white? I realized the answer was no, so I let them go with a warning." The community noticed the changes too. Complaints about unfair treatment dropped by 30% in just 2 weeks. More importantly, people began sharing positive stories about their interactions with officers. Carmen kept track of all these changes in a special notebook. Each evening, she would write down the day's successes and challenges. On this particular evening, she added a new entry. "Officer Thompson voluntarily shared his body camera footage with the whole precinct today. 2 months ago, he would have resigned rather than admit a mistake. Now he's teaching others. This is how change happens, one brave conversation at a time." She closed the notebook and looked out her office window at the setting sun. On her desk sat a new photo. Officers Thompson and Chen at the community center, sitting and laughing with local residents. Next to it was a thank you card from a community member. "For the first time in my life, I felt heard by a police officer." The precinct radio crackled with routine calls. But now, when officers responded, they carried with them new understanding, new awareness, and new commitment to fair treatment for everyone. As Carmen prepared to head home, she smiled at the sight of Thompson and Chen heading out for their evening patrol together. They walked differently now, not with the swagger of authority, but with the confidence of officers who had learned to serve their community better. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The morning sun shone through the windows of Precinct 23 as Carmen walked through the building, observing how different everything felt now. The walls that once held only official notices now displayed community artwork, photos of officers at neighborhood events, and charts showing the positive changes in police-community relations. Today was special. Local news crews gathered in the precinct's main conference room. The mayor and city council members sat in the front row, along with community leaders and residents. They had come to hear about what the media was calling the Precinct 23 miracle. Carmen stood at the podium, with officers Thompson and Chen seated behind her. She looked out at the crowd, remembering how this journey began with a simple traffic stop. 6 months ago, Carmen began, our precinct faced a choice. We could either continue with old habits that hurt our community, or we could become an example of what police work should truly be about, serving and protecting everyone equally. She clicked through slides showing the dramatic changes in their statistics. Traffic stop complaints had dropped by 75%. Community trust ratings had risen from 34% to 89%. Officer satisfaction scores were at an all-time high. Response times had improved because people were more willing to cooperate with officers they trusted. But more important than the numbers were the stories. Carmen invited Officer Thompson to speak next. He walked to the podium, looking very different from the defensive officer of 6 months ago. "That night when I pulled over our new chief," Thompson said, his voice clear and confident, "I thought I was just doing my job. Now I understand that just doing my job isn't enough. We need to do our job right." He shared stories about the changes he'd seen, how children in the neighborhood now waved at police cars instead of running away, how elderly residents brought cookies to the precinct, how young men who used to avoid eye contact with officers now stopped to chat. Officer Chen spoke next, holding up his worn notebook from all the community meetings he'd attended. "In these pages," he said, "I wrote down hundreds of stories from our community members. Their fears, their hopes, their experiences. These stories changed me. They changed all of us." The mayor stepped forward to announce that Precinct 23's new training program would be implemented citywide. Other police departments from across the country had already requested information about their methods. But the most powerful moment came when Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman from Chen's first community meeting, spoke to the crowd. 6 months ago, I prayed every time my grandson left the house, she said, wiping tears from her eyes. Now, when he gets pulled over, the officers treat him with respect. That's all we ever wanted. After the presentations, Carmen invited everyone to tour the precinct. They saw the Community Connection Center, now a busy hub where officers and residents regularly met for coffee and conversation. They visited the training room where new recruits learned about bias and community relations alongside tactical skills. In the parking lot, Thompson and Chen showed visitors their patrol car's new community outreach equipment, books for children, water bottles for homeless individuals, and information cards in multiple languages. As the day went down, Carmen sat in her office with a fresh cup of coffee. A knock on her door revealed Thompson and Chen. "Chief," Thompson said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "Remember this?" It was his resignation letter from 6 months ago, wrinkled and worn from being carried around. "I kept it as you suggested," he continued, "to remind me of who I didn't want to be." He tore the letter in half. "I don't need it anymore. None of us do." Carmen smiled, remembering her mother's words about the best teachers being our own mistakes. "No, you don't need it anymore, but we'll always need to remember the lesson." As the sun set over Precinct 23, the evening shift began their patrol. Officers greeted residents by name. Kids played basketball with off-duty cops in the community center. The precinct doors stayed open later now, welcoming anyone who needed help or just wanted to talk. Carmen's phone buzzed with a text from her daughter. "Mom, guess what? My friend Sarah wants to become a police officer. She says she wants to work in Precinct 23 because they do things right there." Looking out at her transformed precinct, Carmen replied, "Tell her we're always looking for officers who want to do things right. That's how change happens. One person, one decision, one moment at a time." And somewhere in the city, a patrol car made a traffic stop. The officers approached with respect, the driver felt safe, and another small piece of trust was built in a community that had learned to work together.